Welcome to After Dark Horrors. There are places in this country where the soil itself seems to hold a memory. Fields, forests, and hillsides where the past is not just a chapter in a history book, but a lingering presence, a quiet weight in the air. Nowhere is this more true than in the silent cities of the dead that were born from the Civil War. These are not just graveyards. They are archives of sacrifice etched in stone and soil, row upon row of simple markers, each one representing a life cut short by cannon fire, by fever, by the brutal calculus of war. They stand in silent formation, a final, unending military review. For over a century and a half, these grounds have been places of quiet reflection. But for some, they have been places of profound and unsettling experience. The veil between then and now can be thin in these hallowed places. The echoes of that great, terrible conflict can sometimes become more than just echoes. Tonight, we are not here to talk about battles or strategies. We are here to listen to the whispers that remain. We have 5 stories for you shared by people who walked among these stones and encountered something they cannot explain. These are accounts from historians, reenactors, and descendants, ordinary people who found themselves touching a past that was not ready to be forgotten. So, silence your phone. Dim the lights. Let the modern world fall away. Join us as we step through the iron gates and walk the quiet rows of those who fell, and listen to the stories that have waited for us. Story 1, The Tintype Photographer. Our first story comes from a man named Elias, a historical preservationist and an amateur photographer. His passion is documenting the past, capturing its decay with a stark modern clarity. But one evening, in a forgotten corner of a Virginia battlefield, he would find that sometimes the past is more than willing to be documented. But on its own terms, history for me has always been a tangible thing. It's in the splintered wood of a barn door, the rust patterns on a discarded plow, the way a stone foundation slowly surrenders to moss and ivy. I work as a preservationist, which is a formal way of saying I spend my days trying to convince people that old buildings are worth saving. But my real passion, the thing that gets me out of bed before dawn on a Saturday, is photography. Specifically, I photograph Civil War battlefields and the graveyards that inevitably accompany them. Not the big ones, like Gettysburg or Antietam. I prefer the forgotten places, the small overlooked skirmish sites and the lonely, family plot cemeteries where a handful of soldiers were laid to rest and the world moved on. There's a particular quality of light in those places, especially at dusk. It catches the worn edges of the marble headstones and makes the long grass glow. It's a quiet, melancholic beauty, and I've spent years trying to capture it perfectly. The place I kept returning to was a small, state-maintained cemetery just outside Petersburg, Virginia. It wasn't part of the main battlefield park. It was an island of the past surrounded by encroaching suburban development. A simple, wrought iron fence enclosed about 2 acres of land, dotted with maybe 100 graves. The sign near the gate called it the Hatcher's Run Burial Ground. Most of the men buried there fell during the battle of the same name, a brutal grinding fight in the winter of 1865. They were mostly Union soldiers, far from home. Their headstones were simple and uniform, government-issue markers that stated only a name, a rank, and a state. Corp J. Abernathy, 11th PA Infa. Pvt. M. Schmidt, 5th NY Cav. A few were marked with the most haunting word of all. Unknown. I'd been there a dozen times. I knew its layout. The way the shadows from the ancient oak tree in the center would stretch across the rows of stones as the sun went down. I had photographed it in every season, in every kind of weather. I thought I knew the place. One evening in late October, I went there hoping to catch the last of the autumn foliage. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I arrived later than usual, and the sun was already low in the sky, casting a deep golden light across the field. It was perfect. I set up my tripod and digital camera, framing a shot of a row of headstones backlit by the setting sun. I took a few exposures, adjusting my settings, completely lost in the process. The only sounds were the click of my shutter and the rustle of leaves skittering across the dry grass. As the light began to fade, I packed up my main camera and was about to leave when I noticed him. He was standing near the far fence line, almost hidden in the deepening shadows of a thicket of trees. I hadn't heard him approach. One moment the cemetery was empty, the next he was there. My first thought was that it was another photographer or a local historian, but as I looked closer, my sense of casual curiosity curdled into confusion. He was dressed wrong, not just old-fashioned, but authentically of another time. He wore a dark, slightly rumpled suit with a high collar, a style you'd see in a Matthew Brady photograph. He had a dark beard neatly trimmed and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but it was what he was doing that held my attention. He was a photographer, too, but his camera was something out of a museum. It was a large wooden box camera, the kind from the 1860s, perched on a tall, spindly wooden tripod. He had a dark cloth draped over his head as he fiddled with the lens, his body perfectly still. My heart gave a little flutter of excitement. A reenactor, and a serious one at that. I'd encountered them before at larger battlefields. Men who dedicated their lives to historical accuracy, from the stitching on their uniforms to the hardtack in their haversacks. But I'd never seen one here, in this quiet, out-of-the-way place, and never a civilian photographer. It was a unique and wonderful sight. As a fellow photographer, I felt a sense of camaraderie. I decided to go over and talk to him, to admire his equipment, and ask him about his hobby. I slung my modern camera bag over my shoulder and started walking toward him, my footsteps muffled by the grass. "That's an incredible piece of equipment," I said, my voice friendly. He didn't move. The dark cloth remained over his head. He was utterly still, a black-draped statue against the twilight. I stopped a few yards away, feeling a little awkward. Maybe he hadn't heard me. Or maybe he was one of those reenactors who was so deep in character that he wouldn't acknowledge someone from the future. I'd met a few of those. They could be intense. "Sorry to bother you," I tried again, a little louder. "I'm a photographer myself. I've just never seen a wet plate camera in action before. It's beautiful." Slowly, he pulled the cloth from his head. He turned to look at me, and I felt a strange, prickling chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and deeply set. They seemed to absorb the fading light. There was an intensity in his gaze, a profound and weary sadness that felt ancient. He wasn't acting. This wasn't a character. This was him. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, then at my modern digital camera, then back at my face. His expression was unreadable. "It is not for action," he said. His voice was low and raspy, with a faint, unplaceable accent. It was the voice of a man who didn't speak often. "Somaoi, it is for stillness. For permanence." "Right," I said, feeling clumsy and modern. "Of course, the exposure times are long." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The world moves. It blurs, but the soul, if you are patient, the soul holds still, just for a moment." Long enough, I wasn't sure what to say to that. It was poetic and deeply strange. I gestured toward the rows of graves, bathed now in the cool blue light of dusk. Are you photographing the cemetery?" "I am photographing the residents," he replied, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. A wave of unease washed over me. "The residents. Not the graves, not the headstones. The residents." It was an odd choice of words. "Well," I stammered, trying to steer the conversation back to solid ground. "I'll come. It's a beautiful evening for it." The light was perfect. "The light is sufficient," he said, turning his attention back to his camera. He reached into a wooden crate at his feet and pulled out a small square plate of dark glass, a tin-type plate. He handled it with a practiced, delicate precision. "But the veil is thin tonight. It makes the work easier, the veil." The phrase hung in the air between us. I knew what he meant. I'd heard it from paranormal enthusiasts and ghost hunters. The veil between worlds, but hearing it from this man, with his archaic camera and his profound solemnity, it didn't sound like a cliché. It sounded like a technical observation. He slid the glass plate into the back of the camera. "John Despan, Itika Mambatskia." "They're lonely," he said, his back to me now. "They were promised remembrance. A name carved in stone is not remembrance. It is an address. They crave a face. Their own face?" I stood there frozen as the last vestiges of logic began to crumble. This man wasn't a reenactor. He wasn't a hobbyist. I was in the presence of something else entirely. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A local eccentric? An actor practicing a part? But my gut, the primal, instinctual part of my brain, was screaming at me that I was in danger. Not of physical harm, but of something far worse. A danger to my understanding of the world. "What? What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes fixing on me again. "Have you ever seen a spirit photograph, son? Like the old Victorian hoaxes? With the double exposures and the cheesecloth ghosts?" A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed his face. The world is full of charlatans. They use tricks to imitate a truth they are too blind to see. They fake the shadow, but I capture the substance. He gestured with his chin toward a specific headstone, about 20 feet in front of his camera. It was one of the unknown markers. This boy, for example, from Ohio. He died of the fever in the winter of '65. His mother never saw his face again. She died believing he was a coward who had deserted. He has waited a long time for his portrait. I stared at the blank stone, then back at the photographer. My blood felt like ice in my veins. "How can you possibly know that?" "They tell me," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "When they are ready to be seen, they tell me." He moved to the side of his camera and took hold of a small pneumatic bulb attached to a hose, the shutter release. He looked not at the camera, but at the empty space directly in front of the unknown headstone. He seemed to be focusing on something I couldn't see. "Be still now, son," he murmured, his voice soft and coaxing. "Just for a moment. Hold the memory of your face. That's it. Hold it fast." He squeezed the bulb. There was no click, no sound at all. Nothing happened. The air was still. The cemetery was silent. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, probably 10 or 15 seconds, and then released the bulb. He calmly removed the glass plate from the camera, his movements economical and precise. He took it back to his wooden crate, which I now saw was a portable dark box, and began the developing process, mixing chemicals in small trays. I should have run. I should have turned and sprinted out of that cemetery and never looked back. But I was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a terrifying, all-consuming curiosity. I had to see. I had to know. I walked slowly toward him, my feet feeling heavy and disconnected from my body. He worked silently, his gaunt face illuminated by the faint, ghostly glow of a small lantern inside his developing box. He swished the plate through the developer, then the fixer. The acrid smell of the chemicals hit my nose, a sharp, grounding scent in the midst of the impossible. Finally, he pulled the plate out. It was a tin type, a positive image on a dark background. He held it up, tilting it to catch the last of the ambient light. "There now," he whispered, a note of satisfaction in his raspy voice. "A good likeness." He handed it to me. My hand trembled as I took the small metal plate. It was still damp and cool from the chemicals. I looked down at it, and I saw him. It was a portrait. A clear, sharp, impossibly detailed portrait of a young man, no older than 16. He was not smiling. His expression was one of solemn confusion. He had wide, frightened eyes and a soft, boyish face that hadn't yet been hardened by war. He was wearing the rough wool of a Union private's uniform. He was translucent. I could see the headstone and the trees behind him, right through his body. But he was undeniably there. His face, his uniform, the buttons on his coat. It was not a double exposure. It was not a trick. It was the portrait of a ghost. I felt the world tilt on its axis. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the impossible object in my hand. "He can rest now," the photographer said quietly. His face is remembered. I looked up from the tintype, my eyes wide with a million questions. But he was already packing up. He moved with a silent, unhurried efficiency, collapsing his tripod, placing his chemical bottles back in their designated slots in the crate. It was as if this extraordinary reality-shattering event was, for him, just another day at the office. "Who? What are you?" I finally choked out. He latched the lid of his large wooden crate and stood up. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in his dark eyes. "I am a collector of forgotten faces," he said. "A cartographer of echoes. There are more of them than there are of you. They are the true majority, and they are also terribly lonely." He picked up his crate in one hand and the folded tripod in the other. "You have a good eye," he said, nodding toward my camera bag. "You see the beauty in the decay, but you are only capturing the shell. Remember that there is always something inside." And with that, he turned and began to walk away, not toward the gate where I had entered, but toward the back fence, where the woods grew thick and dark. "Wait," I called out, taking a step after him. "The picture. This is yours." He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, and in a few steps, he seemed to melt into the deep shadows of the trees. He didn't rustle a single leaf. He was just there, and then he was gone. I stood alone in the center of the Hatcher's Run burial ground in the deep twilight, the silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. The cemetery, a place that had always felt peaceful and melancholic, now felt charged with an unseen energy. Every headstone seemed to be watching me. I looked down at the tintype still clutched in my hand. The face of the young spectral soldier stared back at me, his eyes full of a sorrow that was more than a century old. I don't know how long I stood there before the cold finally seeped into my bones and broke the spell. I stumbled back to my car in a daze, my mind a whirlwind of impossibility. I still have the tintype. It sits in a locked box on my desk. I have shown it to no one. Who would believe me? They would call it a clever fake, a digital manipulation printed on metal. They would explain it away because the alternative is unthinkable. But I know what I saw. I know who I spoke to. I don't go to the small forgotten cemeteries at dusk anymore. My passion for it is gone, replaced by a deep and abiding fear. I can no longer look at a weathered headstone without thinking of the photographer's words. A name carved in stone is not remembrance. It is an address. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the tintype and look at the face of that boy from Ohio, and I wonder about the photographer. Is he a ghost, a spirit, or something else? A timeless entity drawn to places of great sorrow, his strange camera capturing what our eyes cannot see. I don't know, but I am certain of one thing. He is still out there in the fading light, in the quiet places where the dead lie sleeping. He is moving among the stones, setting up his wooden camera, and coaxing the lonely souls to be still just for a moment, long enough to be remembered, long enough to have their portrait taken by the man who photographs ghosts, Story 2, The Phantom Regiment of Chickamauga. In our next account, we travel from the graveyards of Virginia to the dense, tangled forests of northern Georgia. The Battle of Chickamauga was one of the deadliest engagements of the entire war, a brutal clash in a wilderness so thick that regiments became lost, and soldiers could barely see the enemy until they were nearly upon them. The name Chickamauga is thought to derive from a Native American word meaning River of Death. It is a name the forest has lived up to. This story comes to us from a woman named Sarah, a professional audio engineer. Her job is to capture sound, but in the woods of Chickamauga, she would capture a sound that was never meant for her equipment, an echo that has been marching on a loop for more than 150 years. My world is made of sound waves. I don't just hear things, I see them as waveforms on a screen. I feel them as frequencies in my chest. I'm a field recordist and sound designer for historical documentaries. When you watch a special about the Roman Empire and hear the authentic clank of a gladius being drawn from a leather scabbard, there's a chance that's my work. I'm a stickler for authenticity. I'll spend a week trying to get the perfect sound of wind whistling through a specific type of cracked stone. My colleagues call me obsessive. I call it professional. Last year, I was hired for a major PBS documentary about the Civil War's Western theater. My assignment was to capture the sound of the battlefields as they are today. The director was very specific. He didn't want cannon fire and musket shots. He wanted the ambiance, the terroir of the soundscape. He wanted the audience to hear what a soldier might have heard in the moments before the battle. The wind in the pines, the specific bird song of northern Georgia, the rustle of leaves. He wanted to create a bed of authentic, natural sound upon which they would lay the narration and the letters from soldiers. My job was to capture silence, or what passes for it, in nature. Chickamauga National Military Park was my primary location. It's a sprawling, beautiful, and deeply somber place. Unlike the open fields of Gettysburg, much of Chickamauga is dense forest and confusing rolling terrain. The park is dotted with thousands of monuments, markers, and memorial plaques, standing like silent sentinels in the woods. I arrived in early November. The tourist season was over and the park was mostly empty. The air was cool and sharp, and the trees had shed most of their leaves, carpeting the forest floor in a thick, crunchy layer of brown and gold. It was perfect. Less foliage meant sound would travel more cleanly. My first day was spent in a place called the Brotherton Field. It's a wide, open clearing where some of the heaviest fighting occurred. I set up my gear, a state-of-the-art multi-track recorder, and a series of highly sensitive microphones placed in a wide array to capture a full stereo image. I sat for 2 hours perfectly still, just listening and recording. The world was a gentle symphony of rustling leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the sigh of the wind. It was peaceful, meditative. That evening, back in my hotel room, I put on my professional-grade headphones to review the day's recordings. This is my favorite part of the process, the deep listening, where you can hear every tiny detail the microphones picked up. I heard the delicate sound of an acorn falling from a tree and hitting the earth. I heard the flutter of a bird's wings as it took flight 100 yards away. And then I heard something else. It was incredibly faint, on the very edge of the noise floor, a low rhythmic shuffling sound. It was intermittent, masked by the wind. I isolated the frequency and amplified it. Shh, shh, shh. It had a cadence, a rhythm. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer walking through the dry leaves. But it was too steady, too monotonous. My next thought was contamination. Maybe a hiker I hadn't seen walking on a distant trail. It was annoying, but it happened. I made a note to go to a more isolated location the next day. My chosen spot was an area known as Vineyard Field. I lugged my gear deep into the woods off the main path, checking my map to make sure I was far from any designated trails. I set up again, this time feeling confident I would get a pure, uncontaminated recording. The silence here was deeper, the woods more imposing. I sat for 3 hours as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the forest in long, distorted shadows. Back in the hotel that night, I queued up the new recordings, a sense of anticipation in my chest. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first hour, it was perfect. Pure natural ambience. But then it started again. She. It was the same sound but clearer this time, and it wasn't just shuffling. Beneath it, I could now discern another layer. A faint metallic clinking, a soft leathery creak. It was the sound of people walking. Not one person, many dozens, maybe more. They were walking in unison, their footfalls creating that steady, shuffling rhythm in the leaves. I felt a prickle of annoyance. Had a tour group gone off trail? I hadn't seen or heard a soul the entire time. My microphones were sensitive, but not that sensitive. They couldn't pick up sounds from a mile away. These sounds were closer. My logical mind started grasping for straws. A trick of the wind, some strange acoustic phenomenon of the valley. But the sound was too specific. It was the sound of men on the march. The next day, I went to the park's visitor center and spoke to a ranger, a friendly older man with a deep knowledge of the park's history. I asked him if there were any reenactment groups or park service staff who might have been conducting drills in the Vineyard Field area. He shook his head. No, ma'am. Not this time of year, and never off the designated paths. We're very strict about preservation. The ground out there is sacred. He paused, giving me a curious look. Why do you ask? I hesitated, feeling foolish. Oh, no reason. I'm a sound recordist, and I thought I picked up some distant chatter on my equipment. The ranger's friendly expression didn't change, but his eyes held a new intensity. Sound carries in funny ways out here, he said, his voice a little lower. The woods, they hold on to things. You hear a lot of stories. I left the visitor center feeling more unsettled than before. The woods hold on to things. It was the kind of folksy, ominous phrase you'd expect to hear, but it didn't help my rational mind find a foothold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sterile hotel room, the recordings playing over and over in my head. The shuffling, the clinking, the creaking. I was a scientist of sound, a technician. There had to be a logical explanation. I decided I needed to go back one more time with my most sensitive, specialized piece of equipment, a parabolic microphone. It's a large dish that can focus on and isolate a sound from a great distance. My plan was to pinpoint the source, to prove to myself that it was just a group of hikers on a distant ridge or traffic from a highway the wind was carrying in a strange way. I chose a place that was both historically significant and deeply isolated. A small clearing near the area where the Wilder Brigade, a famous Union unit armed with Spencer repeating rifles, had held a crucial position. The woods here were particularly dense and ancient. It was dusk when I arrived at the time of day the director called the magic hour, but which now felt distinctly menacing. I set up my main recording array as usual, but this time I also had the parabolic dish. I put on my headphones, connecting them directly to the dish, and began to slowly scan the forest around me, like a submarine operator listening for an enemy ship. For a long time there was nothing but the wind. The sun had set, and the world was bathed in a deep, gloomy twilight. The temperature was dropping fast. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. I was about to pack it in to write the whole thing off as a fluke, an auditory illusion. And then I heard it through the dish. It wasn't faint anymore. It was crisp and clear. It was the sound of a single drummer tapping out a steady, monotonous marching beat. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from a thicket of trees about 200 yards to my west. There was no one there. I was looking right at it. It was just trees and shadows. I swung the dish in a slow arc. The drumming was joined by the familiar rhythmic shuffling. It was a column of men marching to the beat of that drum. I could hear the rustle of their wool uniforms, the clink of their canteens against their belts, the soft groan of leather straps. And I could hear voices, low murmuring whispers. Too faint to make out words, but it was undeniably human speech. My hands were trembling. My professional detachment was gone, replaced by a primal creeping dread. I was pointing a microphone at a ghost army. I took the headphones off, my ears ringing in the sudden silence. The real silence. The forest was quiet. I couldn't hear the drumming or the marching with my own ears. It was only there, in the amplified, focused world of the microphone. This is a phenomenon, I told myself, my teeth chattering. A residual haunting. That's what I tried to tell myself. But the feeling in my gut wasn't scientific curiosity. It was terror. And then the wind died. The forest fell completely, unnaturally still. And in that absolute silence, I heard it. With my own ears, tap, 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 tap. It was distant, but it was there. No headphones, no amplifier. The drummer boy had stepped out of the recording and into my world. The shuffling started. A soft whisper of leaves from all around me. The murmuring voices swirled in the air. It was no longer coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. The column of soldiers wasn't in front of me anymore. I was in the middle of it. I stayed completely frozen, crouched behind my equipment. The air grew heavy and cold, a damp chill that sank into my bones. I could feel a strange pressure in the air, a sense of displacement, as if the space around me was crowded with unseen bodies. The sounds grew louder, closer. The steady tramp of hundreds of boots on dry leaves. The jingle of bayonets. A man coughed, a dry racking sound so close to my left ear that I flinched violently. A low groan of pain came from my right. Urgent, hushed commands cut through the air. Close ranks. Steady, boys, steady. It was a full-blown auditory nightmare. I was engulfed in the sound of a phantom regiment marching to a battle that had ended 150 years ago. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressed my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound wasn't just in the air. It was inside my head. A deafening, multi-layered cacophony of the past. The smell of damp wool, sweat, and black powder filled my nostrils. The drum was the worst. It was right on top of me now, a physical concussion in my chest, a relentless beat that seemed to be trying to force my own heart into its rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. I have no idea how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, an eternity? I was lost in a sea of spectral sound, my sense of self dissolving. I was no longer Sarah, the sound recordist. I was just a terrified consciousness adrift in a moment of historical agony. Then, as if a giant volume knob were being turned down, the sounds began to recede. The marching, the whispers, the groans, they all moved past me, continuing on their inexorable path through the forest, heading east. They faded into the distance until the only sound left was the drum. Tap, 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 growing fainter and fainter until it too was swallowed by the silence. I was left alone in the pitch-black forest, trembling uncontrollably. The silence that returned was profound, absolute, and more terrifying than the noise had been. I didn't pack my gear properly. I grabbed my recorder and the parabolic dish, and I ran. I crashed through the woods, branches whipping at my face, stumbling over roots, guided only by the faint glow of my phone screen. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, threw the gear in the back, and sped away from that place. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the drum. It took me a week to work up the courage to listen to the final recording. I had to know if I had captured it or if I had simply lost my mind. I loaded the file into my editing software, my hand shaking on the mouse. The waveform was there. It started with silence, and then a massive, chaotic spike of audio that lasted for nearly 7 minutes. It was all there. The marching, the clinking, the whispers, the commands, the groans, the drum. It was all crystal clear, a perfect high-fidelity recording of an army of ghosts. I spent hours analyzing it, using filters to isolate individual sounds. I heard the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. I heard a man weeping quietly. I heard an officer with a hoarse voice giving the order, "Fix bayonets." And then I found the voice. It was separate from the others, recorded on a different microphone in the array, the one I had placed closest to where I had been crouching. It was a young man's voice, clear as a bell, speaking directly into the microphone as if he were standing right next to it. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't shouting. He was just asking a simple, heartbreaking question. Is it over yet? I slammed my laptop shut. I couldn't breathe. That voice. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a residual sound. It was an intelligence. A lost soul caught in a loop who had seen me, a strange visitor from another time, and had asked a question. I finished my contract for the documentary. I gave them the recordings of the wind and the birds. I never told the director what I had captured that night near the Wilder Brigade's position. Those sounds were not for a documentary. They were not for anyone. I don't do field recording anymore. I sold my equipment. I work in a studio now, creating sounds from scratch. I can't be out in the quiet places. The silence is too loud. It's an empty stage, and I'm always terrified of what might walk onto it. The recording from that night is on a hard drive, locked in a safe. I've never listened to it again. Sometimes I'm tempted to destroy it, but I can't. It's evidence. Evidence of what? I'm not sure. That the past is never truly past? That the woods remember? Or that there are still soldiers out there, lost in the forests of Chickamauga, marching to a phantom drum, still waiting for the battle to end. Story 3. The Letter from Stones River. The dead leave more than just their bones in the soil. They leave behind echoes of their final moments, the fear, the confusion, the desperate longing for a home they would never see again. Most of the time these echoes are too faint to be noticed, but sometimes a person comes along who is, for whatever reason, tuned to the right frequency, and they hear the past not as a sound, but as a feeling. Our third story takes us to Tennessee, to the site of the Battle of Stones River. Fought over New Year's of 1862 and 1863, it was a particularly vicious and chaotic battle, waged in freezing rain and dense cedar thickets. The National Cemetery established there as a place of profound order and peace, a stark contrast to the brutal violence that consecrated the ground. This account comes from a woman named Clara, a genealogist by trade. Her life was dedicated to uncovering the facts of the past, but one ancestor would force her to experience its feelings. Genealogy isn't about ghosts. It's about data. Birth certificates, census records, marriage licenses, ship manifests. It's a meticulous, often tedious process of connecting dots, of building a family tree on a foundation of verifiable facts. I've always been the rational one in my family, the one who deals in proof and documentation. While my cousins were sharing romanticized stories about our ancestors, I was the one in the archives, digging up the truth. And the truth is usually far less romantic. It's poverty, it's illness, it's a life of hard labor ending in an unmarked grave. But there was one story in my family that always held a certain mystique. One ancestor whose life ended not in a quiet fade, but in a flash of history. Private Daniel Rowe, my great-great-great-uncle. Daniel was my grandmother's favorite story. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, a farm boy from rural Pennsylvania who enlisted in 1862. He was, by all accounts, a gentle soul, known for his skill with animals and his quiet disposition. The only reason we knew anything about his personality was because of his letters. He wrote home constantly, not about the grand strategies of the war, but about the small details, the ache in his feet, the poor quality of the food, the beauty of a sunset over a strange new landscape. His letters were full of a profound and aching homesickness. His last letter was written on Christmas Day, 1862, from a camp outside Nashville, Tennessee. It was short, and it felt off. The handwriting was shaky. He wrote of the constant freezing rain, the mud that was ankle-deep everywhere, and a feeling of deep foreboding that had settled over the camp. The final line was, "There is a tension in the air. The officers are quiet, which is always a bad sign. I pray this coming year brings peace, and I can once again see the fields of home. I must end this now. The drum is calling us to form up. I will write again when I am able." He never did. The Battle of Stones River began a few days later. The official notification the family received was stark and brutal. Killed in action, December 31st, 1862. His body was never returned. For my family, he simply vanished into the mud and chaos of that Tennessee battlefield. For over a century, he was just a name on a piece of paper, a ghost in a story. Finding him became my personal obsession, my holy grail of genealogy. It took me 2 years of cross-referencing military records, pension applications, and the archives of the National Park Service. But I finally found him. Private Daniel Rowe was not missing. He was buried in the Stones River National Cemetery, grave number 4218. The day I drove to the cemetery, I felt a strange mix of triumph and solemnity. It was a cool, overcast day in late autumn. The sky was a uniform sheet of gray, and the air was still. The cemetery is vast, a sea of over 6,000 headstones arranged in perfect concentric circles around a towering central monument. The sheer scale of it is breathtaking and heartbreaking. Each stone, a life. I walked the curved rows, my shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The stones were identical, rounded at the top, weathered by 150 years of sun and rain. I found his section and then his row. And then I saw it. Hero Penna. The inscription was faint, but it was there. I stood before the stone, the culmination of my long search. I had found him. I had brought his story full circle. I reached out and placed my hand on the top of the cold, damp marble. It was a simple gesture of connection, of remembrance. "I found you, Daniel," I whispered, and then it happened. It wasn't a sound or a vision. It was a feeling, a wave of emotion so powerful and so alien that it buckled my knees. It was a feeling of homesickness, but it was a strain of homesickness I had never known. This wasn't the mild melancholy of being away from home for a week. This was a deep soul-crushing despair, a longing for a specific patch of earth, for a specific slant of light through a barn door, so intense that it felt like a physical wound. It was the feeling of a boy who knew with absolute certainty that he would never see his home again. The feeling was so overwhelming that I snatched my hand back from the stone as if I'd been burned. I stumbled back, gasping for air. My own heart was hammering, but the emotion I felt wasn't my own panic. It was that deep, resonant sorrow. I looked around. The cemetery was quiet, empty save for a groundskeeper on a distant mower. I was alone. I tried to rationalize it. I was emotional. I had been working on this for years. I was standing at the grave of a young relative who had died tragically. Of course I was sad. I was just projecting my own feelings, amplified by the somber atmosphere of the place. It was a perfectly logical explanation, but it felt like a lie. The emotion had felt external. It had been poured into me. I drove back to my hotel in a daze, the feeling slowly receding, leaving behind a strange emotional hangover like the ghost of a migraine. I tried to shake it off, to put it out of my mind, but that night as I lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed, I smelled wood smoke. Not the pleasant autumnal smell of a fireplace, but the thick, greasy smoke of 1,000 damp campfires clinging to wet wool. I sat up, sniffing the air. The room was sterile, climate-controlled. There was no source for the smell. I buried my face in my pillow, my heart beginning to race, and told myself I was imagining it. The next day I flew home. I tried to return to my normal life, to my meticulous world of facts and data, but the experience had left a crack in my reality. Things were different. I would be at my desk working and suddenly be hit by a wave of that same profound homesickness, so crippling I would have to stop what I was doing and just breathe. I started feeling a constant low-level anxiety, a feeling of being watched and waiting for something terrible to happen. The sensory bleed-through, as I started to call it, became more frequent. I'd be eating lunch and my food would suddenly taste bland and gritty, like stale bread. I'd feel a phantom chill in my heated apartment, a damp cold that seemed to emanate from my own bones. I was becoming a stranger to myself. My own emotions felt distant, replaced by this intrusive, melancholic static. I lost weight. Dark circles formed under my eyes. When I looked in the mirror, the face staring back at me seemed haunted, the eyes wide with a fear that wasn't mine. It was the face of a young man, exhausted and terrified, superimposed over my own. I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that it was Daniel. My brief contact with his gravestone hadn't just been a moment of emotional resonance. I had opened a door, and his consciousness, or some fragment of it, a powerful emotional echo trapped in that stone, had latched on to me. He wasn't haunting me. He was sharing his death with me. I became desperate. I stopped sleeping. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth was a constant presence in my apartment. I could hear the faint, distant sound of men murmuring, the jingle of a harness. I was losing my mind, or worse, I was losing myself. My own identity was being eroded, overwritten by the final traumatic days of a boy who had died a century and a half ago. I knew I had to go back. I had to close the door I had opened. A week later, I was back at Stones River. This time, I wasn't a triumphant genealogist. I was a terrified woman on a desperate pilgrimage. I brought with me a small leather-bound portfolio. Inside was every letter Daniel had ever written home, carefully preserved in archival sleeves, including the last, unfinished one. I walked through the cemetery, my steps heavy with dread. The air felt thick, charged. When I reached grave 4218, the feeling of sorrow was already palpable, a cold pocket in the air. I could feel him waiting. My first instinct was to recoil, to run, but I knew that wouldn't work. I couldn't escape him. He was already inside me. I had to do something else. I couldn't just sever the connection. I had to resolve it. He was a boy who died alone, far from home, his story unfinished. He wasn't a malevolent spirit. He was a lost echo, replaying his final moments, desperate for an ending. And I had become his unwilling audience. With trembling hands, I sat down on the damp grass in front of his headstone. I didn't touch it. I opened the portfolio. "Daniel," I said, my voice shaking. "My name is Clara. I'm your great-great-grandniece. Your sister, Mary's line. We remember you. You were never forgotten." I started to read. I read his first letter, full of boyish bravado and excitement. I read his letters from training camp, his complaints about the drills and the food. I read his descriptions of the long marches, the changing seasons. My voice grew stronger as I read, more confident. I was no longer just a terrified victim. I was a storyteller. I was giving him his own life back. The oppressive atmosphere began to change. The profound sorrow was still there, but it was now mingled with something else, a sense of attention, of listening. I read through months of his life, his words filling the quiet air of the cemetery. Finally, I reached the last letter. The one from Christmas Day, 1862. I read it slowly, my voice dropping. I read about the rain, the mud, the sense of foreboding. I reached the final chilling line. It must end this now. The drum is calling us to form up. I will write again when I am able. I paused. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. You weren't able, I whispered. You died 6 days later. You fought in the slaughter pen, in the cedar forest. You were brave, and you were not alone. You were with your regiment. I took a deep breath. This was the part that mattered. This was the part I hadn't planned, the words that were coming from some place of pure instinct. But your story didn't end here, Daniel. Your sister Mary, she got married. She had a son she named after you. He was a farmer, like your father. He had children, and they had children, generations of them. Doctors, teachers, mechanics, people who lived long lives, who fell in love, who had families of their own. All because you and your brothers fought. Your sacrifice. It meant something. It wasn't for nothing. Your family remembered you. I remember you. As I spoke, I felt a change. It was like a tightly wound spring slowly uncoiling inside my chest. The phantom chill in my bones receded. The heavy blanket of sorrow began to lift. The air cleared. I felt a sense of release, of a long-held breath being let out. I sat there for a long time, in the quiet of the afternoon. The feeling was gone. The presence, the echo, whatever it had been, was at peace. I was alone again. Truly alone. I placed my hand on the gravestone one last time. It was just a piece of cold, wet marble. Nothing more. The experiences stopped. The smells, the sounds, the waves of emotion, they all vanished. I was myself again. But I am not the same. The world is different for me now, or I am different in it. Before, history was a collection of facts. Now I know it is a collection of feelings stored in the most unlikely of places. I can't go into an antique store anymore. I'll pick up an old silver locket and feel a faint, fleeting echo of the joy its owner felt on her wedding day. I'll touch a worn, leather-bound book and feel a flicker of the anxiety and excitement of the student who first read it. It's not overwhelming like it was with Daniel. It's a faint hum beneath the surface of things, a new layer of sensory input I can't turn off. I have been tuned to a new frequency. I am a genealogist who can now feel the ghosts of emotions left behind on the artifacts of people's lives. I found my ancestor, and in doing so, I lost a piece of my own comfortable, rational world. I learned that some stories don't want to be just told. They demand to be felt. And that the quietest places, the ones that seem the most peaceful, are often the ones that hold the most profound and lingering pain. Story 4. The Surveyor of Andersonville. Not all Civil War graveyards were born from the heat of battle. Some were born from the slow, cold calculus of misery. Of all the sites that bear the scars of that conflict, few are as heavy with sorrow as Andersonville. It was not a battlefield. It was a prison. Camp Sumter, as it was officially known, was a hastily constructed stockade in southern Georgia designed to hold 10,000 men. By the war's end, it had held over 45,000. Of those, nearly 13,000 died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. They died in a 26-acre field of mud and filth, without shelter, without medicine, and without hope. Today, the Andersonville National Historic Site contains a pristine and orderly cemetery where those 13,000 men are laid to rest. The grounds are peaceful, green, and meticulously maintained, but the land itself has not forgotten what it was forced to witness. Our next story comes from a man whose job is to measure and define the land, a land surveyor named Mark. He went to Andersonville to map a piece of ground and found that some places refused to be measured because their dimensions are not of space, but of suffering. I live my life in a world of straight lines and fixed points. As a licensed land surveyor, my job is the enemy of ambiguity. I use multi-$1,000 GPS transits, laser measures, and centuries-old principles of trigonometry to define reality. I draw the lines that separate your property from your neighbors. I tell engineers where a building can safely stand. My work is a conversation with the earth, but it's a conversation conducted in the unforgiving language of mathematics. There is no room for interpretation. A point is either where it is or it isn't. So, when my firm was contracted to perform a topographical survey for a proposed new drainage system along the perimeter of the Andersonville National Historic Site, I saw it as just another job. A sensitive one, to be sure, given the location, but fundamentally no different from surveying a new suburban development. The goal was the same: map the terrain, define its boundaries, and deliver the data. I'd never been to Andersonville before. The first time I drove through the gates, the sheer scale of the cemetery was staggering. It's a city of the dead, with long, straight rows of marble headstones stretching across rolling green hills. It's beautiful in a profoundly sad way. My work area was mostly outside the cemetery proper, on the undeveloped land that bordered the historic stockade site. I began, as I always do, by establishing my control points. These are fixed, known coordinates that anchor the entire survey. I set up my primary GPS base station on a hill overlooking the site, letting it communicate with a network of satellites to lock its position down to the millimeter. From there, I would walk the property with my rover unit, a pole with a GPS receiver on top, to map the contours of the land. The first day was uneventful. I worked my way along the northern boundary, system performing flawlessly. The air was thick and humid, typical for southern Georgia, and the only sounds were the buzzing of insects and the distant hum of traffic. The second day is when the anomalies began. I was working my way south, approaching the edge of the National Cemetery. I needed to take a reading on a benchmark set into the corner of the cemetery wall. I placed the tip of my rover pole on the small brass disc and waited for the GPS to achieve a fixed solution. Usually this takes a few seconds, but it kept floating. The screen on my data collector showed the coordinates jumping, shifting by a few feet in every direction. I rebooted the system. It was a finicky piece of equipment sometimes. I tried again. Same result. The GPS unit, which could tell me my precise location anywhere on the planet, seemed to believe I was teleporting randomly within a 10-foot circle. Satellite interference, I muttered to myself. Trees. The area was thick with tall Georgia pines, and sometimes a dense canopy can block the signal. It was frustrating, but it was a known issue. I made a note in my logbook and decided to come back to that point later, hoping the satellite constellation would be in a better position. But as I moved away from the cemetery wall, the problem vanished. 20 yards out, my rover locked in instantly, solid as a rock. I walked back toward the wall. As I got closer, the signal started to dance again. It was as if the cemetery itself were emitting some kind of interference, a bubble of spatial uncertainty. It was impossible, but it was happening. I spent the rest of the day feeling unnerved. Surveyors develop a very keen sense of direction and distance. It's second nature. But as I worked near that boundary, my internal compass felt wrong. I'd estimate a distance to a tree at 100 feet, but my laser measure would read 150. I'd start walking a straight line toward a target, counting my paces, only to find myself drifting inexplicably to the left. I felt like a man trying to walk a straight line on the deck of a ship in a heavy swell. That evening, I chalked it all up to fatigue and the oppressive heat. The mind plays tricks. The next day, I had to survey a section that took me directly through a part of the cemetery to reach a portion of the old stockade site. I walked down one of the central pathways, the silent rows of headstones flanking me on either side. The names and states blurred into a single, overwhelming litany of loss. J. Miller, Ohio. Unknown U.S. soldier. Von Beaumont, NY. I found the path I needed, a small gravel track that led into the woods. I followed it for what I thought was about a quarter of a mile. According to the park map, it should have opened up into the clearing where a reconstruction of the north gate of the stockade stood. But the path just kept going. The woods grew thicker, darker. I checked the map again. I should have been there already. I stopped, a prickle of unease on my neck. I pulled out my handheld GPS. It showed my position clearly. I was on the path, exactly where I should be. But the landscape didn't match. I turned around to head back, and my blood went cold. The path was gone. Behind me was just a solid, impenetrable wall of pine trees and dense undergrowth. There was no track, no clearing, no sign that a path had ever been there. It was as if the forest had healed itself the moment I passed through. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my professional calm. I was an expert navigator. I did not get lost, especially not on a marked trail in a national park. I spun around looking for any landmark, any sign of the direction I had come from. But everything looked the same, just an endless sea of trees. I forced myself to be calm. I had my GPS. I could just follow the arrow back to my starting point. I held it up. The arrow pointed directly into the thickest part of the brush. There was no choice. I pushed my way through, branches scratching my face, my expensive work shirt snagging on thorns. It was a miserable, exhausting struggle. After 15 minutes of fighting the terrain, I broke through into a clearing. I was standing on the gravel path I had just been on, not 20 feet from where I had first stopped. I had walked in a perfect, pointless circle. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs. The world felt thin, unreal. The woods were silent, watchful. It felt like I was being toyed with, like a mouse in a maze designed by a cruel and invisible intelligence. I abandoned the survey for that day. As I walked back to my truck, a walk that felt unnervingly longer than it should have, I felt a strange sensation, like the air was growing thick and heavy, pressing in on me. The clean, pine-scented air was replaced by a foul, cloying odor of sickness and despair. It was gone as quickly as it came, but the memory of it, a phantom smell, lingered in my nostrils. I almost quit the job then and there, but my professional pride, my stubborn refusal to be beaten by a piece of land, wouldn't let me. I went back the next day, determined to finish. My final task was to survey the area around a landmark called the Providence Spring. Historically, the prisoners in Andersonville had only one source of water, a polluted creek that ran through the stockade. But in August of 1864, during a thunderstorm, a spring of fresh water miraculously erupted from the ground inside the prison, saving countless men from dying of thirst. It was seen as an act of God. Today, it's housed in a small stone monument. The area around the spring was the epicenter of my problems. My GPS refused to lock. My laser measure gave me readings that changed with every measurement. The very geometry of the space seemed to be in flux. As dusk began to settle, I was making one last attempt to get a reading. I was crouched over my data collector, sweat beading on my forehead, cursing the technology under my breath. When I looked, I was completely, utterly paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was an unwilling observer of a moment of concentrated human misery. I saw a man crawl on his hands and knees to drink from a muddy puddle. I saw another staring blankly at the sky, his face utterly devoid of hope. My gaze was drawn to the Providence Spring Monument, but the stone structure wasn't there. In its place, a group of ragged men were gathered around a muddy hole in the ground, scooping water with their hands. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, was separated from the group. He was crouched on the ground, his back to me. With a small stick, He was intently drawing something in the mud. Driven by a morbid curiosity that overpowered my fear, I took a shaky step closer. I looked over his shoulder at what he was drawing. It was a map, a crude but detailed map of a small town with streets, a river, and a town square all carefully laid out. It was a map of his home. In this place of absolute spatial confinement, his mind had escaped. Surveying the one place he longed to be, he must have sensed my presence. He stopped drawing and slowly looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were pale blue, vacant, and filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical blow. He wasn't seeing me, Mark the surveyor. He was looking through me as if I were a pane of glass at the home he was so desperately trying to map his way back to. The connection, the shared gaze, broke the spell. The world dissolved. The sounds, the smells, the vision of the stockade, it all collapsed in on itself and vanished. I was on my knees in the grass in the dark. The park was closed. The air was clean. I was alone. My equipment lay scattered around me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my gear, and ran. I didn't look back. I drove the 5 hours back to my home in Atlanta that night, without stopping. The next morning, I called my boss and told him I was quitting. I couldn't explain why. I just said the job was finished, which was a lie, and that I was done. I never went back. I sold my surveying equipment and changed careers. I work in an office now, as far away from the raw earth as I can get. I can't look at a map without feeling a trace of that cold panic, that sense of spatial dread. A map is a promise of order, a declaration that the world is knowable and fixed. But I know better. I know there are places where the lines are not straight, where the distances are not fixed. Places where the weight of memory is so heavy, it warps the very fabric of reality. But there is one final detail, one thing that keeps me awake at night more than the memory of the smells or the sounds or the sight of the stockade. The map the boy was drawing in the mud. The crude layout of the streets, the curve of the river, the location of the town square. I recognized it. With a certainty that chills me to my core, I recognized it. It was a perfect map of my own hometown. Story 5, The Scribe of Shiloh. A story is a powerful thing. It can be a monument, a memorial, a way of shaping the chaos of the past into something we can understand. We tell stories of heroes to inspire us and stories of monsters to warn us. But what happens when a place has a story of its own it needs to tell? A story that has been buried, forgotten, and is desperate for a voice. For our final account, we journey to the fields of southwestern Tennessee to Shiloh. The name in Hebrew means place of peace. A tragic irony for the site of one of the most savage battles of the war. Fought in April of 1862, it was, at the time, the bloodiest battle in American history. It was a brutal, chaotic affair, fought by green, inexperienced soldiers in dense woods, tangled thickets, and muddy fields. This story is told by a man named Julian, a historical novelist. His job is to create stories from the bones of history. But at Shiloh, he would find that sometimes the bones still have a voice, and they will not be silenced. I've always believed that to write about the past, you have to walk on it. You have to stand in the place where it happened, feel the sun or the rain on your skin, and breathe the same air. You can't get that from a book. That's my process. I'm a historical novelist, and I've had some modest success writing about the Civil War. My niche is finding tales of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts of heroism. I write about the human spirit triumphing over the horrors of war. My readers, it seems, appreciate the optimism. My next project was to be my magnum opus, a novel centered on the defense of the Hornet's Nest at the Battle of Shiloh. It's a legendary story, a few thousand Union soldiers taking cover in a sunken road and a dense thicket, held off a dozen Confederate assaults for over 7 hours, buying crucial time for the rest of the army to form a final defensive line. It was a story of pure, unadulterated courage. It was my kind of story. So I booked a room at a small inn near the park and planned to spend a week immersing myself in the landscape. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September. The park was quiet, wrapped in the gentle melancholy of early autumn. The fields were green, the monuments stood silent and dignified, and it was hard to imagine the sheer hell that had unfolded there. I spent the first 2 days just walking. I walked the sunken road, tracing the path of the Union line. I stood in the open fields where the Confederate brigades had charged, again and again into a storm of lead. I tried to absorb the scale of it, the geography of courage. On the third day, I decided it was time to write. I didn't want to sit in my sterile hotel room. I wanted to be there. I packed a small satchel with my laptop, a thermos of coffee, and a notebook. I found a spot that felt right. It wasn't in the hornet's nest itself, but on the edge of a field that sloped down toward the infamous Bloody Pond, a small pool of water that was said to have been stained red by the blood of soldiers and horses. I found a large oak tree, one of the few that looked old enough to have been a silent witness to the battle, and sat with my back against its trunk. The spot was peaceful, isolated. I could see the pond shimmering in the distance. It was perfect. I opened my laptop, took a sip of coffee, and placed my fingers on the keys. I was ready to write about heroes. I started with my protagonist, a fictional sergeant from an Illinois regiment. I wanted to describe the scene from his eyes, the smoke, the deafening roar of the muskets, the shouts of his comrades, the look of grim determination on his face as he prepared to meet another charge, but the words didn't come. Or rather, different words came. My fingers moved across the keyboard, but the sentences that appeared on the screen were not the ones in my head. The noise. It isn't a sound, it's a physical thing. It presses on you, a weight that crushes the air from your lungs. You can't think. You can't hear the man next to you screaming. You can only feel the ground shake. And the fear. It's a cold, wet thing living in your belly. It tells you to run. It tells you to hide. It tells you that honor is a word for men who are about to die. I stopped, staring at the screen. Where had that come from? It was dark, visceral. It was the opposite of the heroic narrative I wanted to build. I deleted the paragraph. A writer's mind wanders, I told myself. It was just a false start, a dark tangent. I tried again. I focused on the image of my brave sergeant, reloading his rifle, his movements steady and practiced. My fingers typed. My hands won't stop shaking. I dropped the cartridge, the precious paper tube falling into the mud. My fingers are slick with sweat. Or is it fear? I can't tell. Another volley crashes from the woods in front of us. The man to my left makes a sound like a cough and falls sideways. His eyes are open, looking at nothing. I didn't even know his name. I have to get out of here. I can't die here. I can't. I slammed the laptop shut. My heart was pounding. This wasn't my voice. This wasn't my story. It felt invasive. It was as if another author were whispering in my ear, and my fingers were taking their dictation. I packed up my things, shaken. The peaceful spot by the tree no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. I told myself I was just spooked. The weight of the place, the knowledge of the suffering that had happened there, it was getting to me. I needed to work from a neutral space. That night in my hotel room, I tried again. I closed the curtains, put on some classical music, and focused. You are in control, I told myself. This is your book. I began to write, and for an hour it worked. I wrote about my sergeant, about his leadership, his calm resolve. I was back on track. Relieved, I saved my work and went to bed, feeling that I had finally broken through the strange mental block. I had a dream that night. I was not myself. I was someone else. I was young, maybe 16. I was wearing a blue uniform that was too big for me. I was crouched in a tangle of blackberry bushes, my face pressed into the damp earth. The noise of the battle was all around me, a terrifying, directionless roar. I was clutching a rifle I barely knew how to use. I had gotten separated from my company in the chaos. I was lost, and I was paralyzed by a fear so absolute, so pure, that it had erased every other thought from my mind. I wasn't a soldier. I was a terrified child hiding from the thunder. I woke up in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of mud and gunpowder in my nostrils. The dream had been more real than any dream I'd ever had. I could still feel the thorns of the blackberry bushes scratching my cheek. I stumbled out of bed and went to my laptop, needing to ground myself in my own work, my own story. I opened the file. The chapter I had written the night before was gone. In its place was a single new paragraph. They can't find me here. If I stay low, if I stay quiet, they will pass me by. The fighting is moving away, to the east. I can hear it. It sounds like the world is tearing itself apart. I should try to find my company. I should get up and be a soldier. But my legs won't work. They feel like they are made of stone. My name is Thomas. I am 17 years old, and I think I am a coward. I stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping up my spine. I was the only person with access to my laptop. It was password protected. No one could have done this. I hadn't done this. I was being haunted. Not by a clanking chain or a shadowy figure, but by a story. A story that wanted to be told, and it had chosen me as its scribe. For the next 2 days, I was in a state of low-grade panic. I tried to fight it. I would write a sentence about my hero, and then watch as the cursor would move on its own, deleting it and replacing it with a sentence about Thomas, the terrified boy. I felt like I was in a tug of war for control of my own mind, my own creative process. The story of Thomas unfolded against my will. I learned about his life on a farm in Wisconsin. I learned that he had enlisted because his friends had, and he was afraid of being called a coward if he stayed behind. I learned about his journey south, his first taste of battle, and the moment he broke and ran, seeking refuge in the woods as the battle raged without him. It was a story of shame and fear, the exact opposite of the books that had made my name. It was a story I did not want to write. On my last day, I was at my wit's end. I hadn't written a single usable word of my own. I was exhausted, haunted by the dreams of Thomas, and terrified that I was losing my mind. I went back to the park one last time, drawn back to that same spot under the old oak tree. I didn't bring my laptop, just my notebook and a pen. I stood there in the quiet afternoon, and I spoke to the empty air. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this to me?" The only answer was the rustle of the wind in the leaves. I felt a profound sense of despair. My trip was a failure. My book was dead before it had even begun. I sank to the ground, my back against the tree, and opened my notebook, not intending to write, but just to do something, and then my hand started to move. The pen felt strange in my fingers, both alien and perfectly natural. I watched, disconnected, as my hand began to write, the script flowing across. It told of how he hid in the thicket until nightfall, long after the sounds of fighting had died away. It told of the cold rain that began to fall, soaking him to the bone. It told of how he tried to find his way back in the dark, but he was lost, delirious with fear and the onset of a fever from a small, unnoticed wound in his side. He stumbled through the dark woods for hours, calling out for help, but his voice was just a hoarse whisper. Finally, he collapsed in a shallow ravine, his body giving out. He lay there in the mud and the cold, listening to the drip of water from the trees. He didn't think of glory or honor. He thought of his mother's face. He thought of the warmth of the sun in his father's hayfields. And his last fading thought was not that he was afraid of dying, but that he was afraid of being forgotten, his name forever lost. his story untold. He was afraid no one would ever know he had been there at all. My hand stopped moving. The pen dropped from my fingers. I looked down at the notebook. The pages were filled with the story, and I felt a change in the atmosphere around me. The watchful pressure was gone. The air felt light. I felt a profound sense of release, of a long, painful story finally being heard, and then a deep, echoing silence. He was gone. I left Shiloh the next day. I went home and I transcribed the story from my notebook. It was a novella, almost 40,000 words, written in a single feverish burst of automatic writing. It was the story of Private Thomas Weller, 14th Wisconsin Infantry. I tried to go back to my novel about the hornet's nest. I couldn't. The characters felt like cardboard cutouts. The heroism felt hollow false. The only story that felt real, the only story I could now tell, was Thomas's. I published it. I didn't use my own name. It felt wrong. I published it under the simple, anonymous byline, A Friend. The book was called The Boy in the Ravine. It didn't sell as well as my other books, but it found a small, passionate audience. It was praised by critics for its brutal honesty and its raw, unflinching depiction of a soldier's fear. One reviewer called it the most authentic Civil War story I have ever read. I tried to start a new project after that, a different story from a different battle. But when I sit down to write, when I try to create new characters, new worlds, I can't. The well is dry. There is only one story left inside me. When I place my fingers on the keyboard, only one sentence appears. The noise. It isn't a sound. It's a physical thing. I'm a novelist who can only tell one story. I gave a voice to a forgotten boy, and in return, he took mine. I am no longer an author. I am his scribe, and I will spend the rest of my life telling his story over and over to anyone who will listen. The past is never dead. It's not even past. These words, written by a novelist, feel profoundly true in places like Shiloh, Andersonville, and Stones River. The soil remembers. The stones keep a silent watch. And the echoes of the lives that ended there still resonate, waiting for a quiet moment, a receptive mind, to be heard once more. These places are more than just parks and cemeteries. They are libraries of human experience, filled with stories of courage, of sorrow, of fear, and of a desperate longing for a peace that for some never came. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the quiet corners of our nation's history. The stories you've heard are a reminder that when you walk on hallowed ground, you are never truly alone. The residents are still there, and they're listening. If you have had an experience in a place where the past feels unsettlingly present, we invite you to share it in the comments below. We read them all. Until next time, be careful what you listen for in the silence. You might just hear something answer back.